Good day, everyone. This is Marty Murphy, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this session provided by the HDR UK, in which we're going to discuss data without borders. The title itself, I think, is revelatory, that the data, and let us speak, of course, of the pandemic, as the pandemic itself is borderless. But what our job is, and the responsibility of our four excellent panelists will be, is to guide us in not only the thinking of how these data may be acquired, the excellence and the accuracy of them, very importantly, how they can be shared, and what are some of the vital questions, perhaps in somewhat of an order, that need then to be probed. We have four superb panelists who are going to cover this field with the intention of exciting not only your innovative thinking, but really new research. They will also share the results as they are appearing of their own studies. Our leadoff batter is Callum Semper from University of Liverpool. And we just said that a case study is going to be described, and he's going to give us the first case study that's being prepared to create a timely understanding of a pandemic. Callum, it's an honor to introduce you, and we look forward to your 5-minute presentation, as with your fellow panelists, allowing ample time for our panelists to debate and discuss, and also, of course, to take questions. Thank you, Callum. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. And could I get a thumbs up if you're seeing the proper screen or presenter mode, please? Proper screen?
Yes, looks great.
Thank you very much.
Just enlarge it so it's full screen.
Oh no, so you're probably not seeing the right screen then.
Sorry to swap displays, Callum. This is
Thank
Dan
you.
from Metro. So if you go up to the top and click swap displays.
Okay, are you?
The top of your screen.
Yeah, I've done that.
There you go. Beautiful.
Thank you very much. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for introducing me. A wonderful introduction. Quite an honor to be speaking to an esteemed audience from all over the world. I'm going to tell you about the International Severe Acute Respiratory and Emerging Infection Consortium and how this consortium has changed the paradigm of delivering urgent public health research in a pandemic, and who are the people behind it and what's happened. I'm going to share with you data that is quite up to date too. The usual declarations. I serve as a senior government advisor for the government in the UK. I have share ownership and chair the Infectious Disease Scientific Advisory Board for a company in America that provides outbreak research and capacity for countries not as well served as our own. So the premise of our work is that outbreaks are certain, that we have seen outbreaks roughly every 23 years. The only places when we can't see these in the recent history books is when England was at war with the Americans, and then later at war with the French, and then later at war with everybody else in the Second World War. So it's very likely that there were actually outbreaks crossing continents at these times. It's just that we were all a little bit busy doing other things at the time. We know that these outbreaks are there for certain, but we won't know what will the disease be. Will it be a black plague? Will it be a smallpox? Will it be an influenza? We just don't know. And we're going to need to develop mass diagnostics, understand infection control, develop therapeutics. So it's self-evident that you need rapid research capacity. But how well do we do this? The answer is pretty awful until recently. In the 2009 pandemic, in our country, in the UK, there was one study called FluSyn, led by Professor Jonathan Van Tam, which managed to do observational public health research, that's gathering data only, and he got going about halfway through the first wave. There was one study that did preclinical research, that's gathering the test tubes and looking at inflammatory mediators and genetics. That got going halfway through the second wave, and not a single randomized clinical trial was conducted in 2009 in Britain, America, Europe, and I think one was conducted in China. This would be the ideal. Let's see how we've done. ISARIC was set up in frustration of the outbreak response in 2009, and it was led by Jeremy Farah, now director of the Wellcome Trust. And the current chair is Peter Horby, who, of course, you may recognise as being the principal investigator for the recovery trial. And you'll probably see why in a minute's time, how he's positioned himself. ISRIC is a consortium of networks. These networks are all interested in infectious disease during peacetime. So these networks are well established and have local capacity. That is key. And ISRIC brings them together in the ability to perform pandemic research and sharing data. What ISRIC did at various retreats, held mostly in Annecy, thanks to the Foundation Morieux, was we looked at the kind of research that you would like to do during an outbreak. Much in the same way that a student of English literature will tell you that there are only 7 tropes in English literature. By this I mean A meets B under Silvery Moon, or Hero slays Dragon. You can condense the literature of research in an outbreak really into 4 themes. What we call the clinical characterization protocol, which is the who, what, why, the drug trial, which is an adaptive pragmatic platform, convalescent plasma, which is tricky because you have to catch your survivors and get plasma and qualify it, and the vaccine trial, which is well developed. What ISRIC did that was different was we wrote the protocols. We made sure that data elements between the protocols were harmonized with very simple case report forms. Then we took these protocols to the World Health Organization for pre-approval. Pathogens were deliberately not named. If we look at the clinical characterization protocol, it was designed to be flexible so that the simplest hospital that could manage a pencil and a pad could collect data and upload it through a website. As hospital capacity increased, perhaps they had a clinical research facility or a research nurse, they could do limited biological sampling or intense biological sampling. And we also allowed sites to flex down on the protocol at their own cognition, should there be surge pressure on resources. And this meant that we got very high uptake of what was a very simple protocol to use. We now have data from 340,000 individuals from 1,609 sites across 54 countries, contributing data to the ISRIC platform. And this allows very useful cross-comparison of how the virus is behaving in different countries against different populations. And we can make summary data from this. And this is an inverted population pyramid, which rather than showing the age breakdown for a population, we use to show the ages affected by disease. And you can see that it is a bit of a tornado. There's a bulky excess of males that are frail and elderly, but then under the age of 50, you see an excess of women more responsible for health, social care and education and retail being exposed. So this kind of global harmonization approach has found favor with many investigators. These countries all use the data themselves for their policymakers as well. So the data has great utility for local healthcare policy decisions. And here's an example of one of our reports. Again, here you see that tornado-shaped demographic, excess of frail older men, slight bump of women exposed in health, retail, education, social care, and maternity services. And our data feeds directly to our modelling groups, to our chief medical officers, and our senior scientific advisors. I'm just going to show you the data as of this morning, updated at 3 o'clock, and you'll see that the shape of our data in wave 3 has now changed substantially from what it looked like in wave 2. And that is because we now have a vaccinated population of elderly people. So we're no longer seeing the excess of frail elderly, particularly men, and far more proportionally of under 50 where vaccination is still incomplete. We've used this data to carefully characterize the symptoms in our adults, and this is a cluster correlation matrix of symptoms in adults. You get the classic COVID, and within this population, about a quarter have diarrhea, abdominal pain, and vomiting. If you look at it against children, it's totally different. You see that children have totally different characteristics with this interesting multi-system inflammatory response, which is quite distinct from the cluster of COVID respiratory symptoms.
One minute, Alan.
That's great. I'm on target. We've used our data also to develop a prognostic mortality score. And if you can count up to 20, that's 2 hands and 2 feet for most of us, then you can work out very simply using age, sex, comorbidities, respiratory rate, take an overall score, run it along a curve, and get the probability of death. And this was developed using a data set of 35,000 people for derivation, validated against 22,000, and then validated further using a geographical analysis. This tool has now been validated in external other countries' ISRIC data sets. So we've now got external validation in other countries in Europe, and that's a very useful tool. So the problem that we had in 2009, now thanks to the work of ISRIC, we have got timely observational public health research response. We are using our platform to get material to the scientists, and Peter Horby has been delivering with Martin Landry on the trials, the recovery. For those that want to do a screenshot of references, now is your moment. I must acknowledge my research nurses and medical students, that's 2,500 of them, and our funders. And that is what ISRIC has been up to. Just to say, the very first reports that came out of China used the ISRIC platform tools. And that was such a delight to see our tools being used at the earliest stage of this outbreak. Thank you very much.
Callum, thank you so much for giving us not only the foundation of ISRIC, but its already utilization. The comparison with the original SARS pandemic and COVID-19 could not have been made more dramatic. Tip of the cap also to Sir Jeremy for kicking this also off. With that as a background, Marion, now you're going to, from University of Oxford, Marion Mapham, is going to talk to us about lessons learned from the recovery trial, which was just alluded to, on the use of routine health data for regulatory standard clinical trials. And then she's going to take us going international. Sorry, Marion. And we're looking forward to your presentation. Marion Mapham, please. And you may be on mute.
Sorry, I've done it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try and cover some of those elements in the next 5 minutes, and it's a huge pleasure to be talking to you today on behalf of the recovery trial, obviously on behalf of the chief investigators and all the people who worked very hard to make this trial happen. I'm just going to show my disclosures there, both in terms of funding for the recovery trial itself, and also at the bottom, the statement that I comply with our departmental policy of not accepting any personal payments from industry. So I think some of you may have heard from Martin Landry this morning, talking about the results and impact of the recovery trial. So I just got one slide on results. Recovery is a randomized trial, now recruited 40,000 participants during the pandemic, studying potential treatments for patients hospitalized with COVID-19 and including over 170 hospitals across the UK. Over that time, we have produced results on 9 treatments. We've shown that 3 treatments are effective. Dexamethasone reduces the risk of death by 1/3 in those on a ventilator, slightly less in those receiving oxygen at baseline, with no apparent effect in those with no requirement for ventilatory support at all. Tocilizumab reduces the risk of death by 15% in subset of hospitalized patients who are hypoxic and inflamed. And we heard last week that the monoclonal antibody made by Regeneron reduces death by 1/5 in those without positive antibodies in their blood themselves. Also, and importantly, we showed that these treatments do not have a detectable benefit in patients hospitalized with COVID-19, which allows healthcare systems to focus on treatments which do work. But the purpose of today really is to think about data across borders. And the first thing I wanted to acknowledge is that already health data is certainly in use in the recovery trial is spanning two worlds, if you like. So I just wanted to acknowledge that clinical trials and the use of data in clinical trials is a highly regulated area. In some ways, the methods are very much easier than in non-trial research studies, because you don't really need to worry about confounding and some sorts of bias, because you're also always comparing to the randomized control group. But there are specific methodological issues, and traditionally trials have relied on carefully collected and curated research data and not made the most of routine healthcare data that's available and recorded about patients anyway. Where you're using routine healthcare data, you're talking about identifiable data, and there's real time pressures. There have been 27 data monitoring committees for meetings for the recovery trial, each one needing a complete, up-to-date and rapidly deployed set of data, so that they're looking at the best evidence of the truth. Whereas in some forms of health data science, there's a lot less regulation. You can make use of anonymized data. So having acknowledged that we're already spanning two worlds, this is sort of how it works for recovery. So as well as one of the key factors was to make it simple for the doctors on the ground. So they only have to collect a very, very simple one-page form at randomization and at 28 days. And that's entered into our systems. But we do bring in the patient identifiers, and in the UK, the NHS number, ORCI number, and so on. We send those to the data custodians so that we can link that with the rich set of data that's recorded about those individuals in the health system anyway, and bring that into the recovery database. And this has been really very, very powerful and has allowed us to get complete follow-up on the participants, to know in almost real time when participants have died, so that publications and the Data Monitoring Committee are looking at up-to-date data. With that in mind, before we talk about going international, I wanted to say that we've gone national, and of course the UK is perhaps not as united as we might like in terms of data, and we've collected these sets. I'm not going to go through them all. We've collected these data sets from England, Scotland and Wales, with data coming in from Public Health Scotland, National Records of Scotland, NHS Digital, Sale Data Bank, ICNARC and the Renal Registry, with other sources coming on board at the moment. This is eminently doable. It just requires a lot of work. You've really got to do everything 3 or 4 times over. But providing you resource it right, all the systems are in place in the UK, meaning that you can get joined up routine healthcare data on participants right across the UK. So in my closing slide, I just want to kind of take a step back and think about what the challenges might be now. So we've also already got research data and routine healthcare data coming in the UK from all our UK sites. That's hard work, but the systems are working, and it has made a massive contribution to the speed and the quality of the trial, and also enables us to follow those patients up long term, because the local site data collection stops at 28 days, but we actually sought consent to follow these patients up through their routine healthcare registry and registry data for 10 years afterwards. So we'll be able to find out what the long-term effects of the treatments we're testing are, and that's really valuable. We're bringing on board international sites, with sites in Nepal and in Indonesia currently recruited, and currently in setup phase in Vietnam, Ghana and South Africa, and hoping to expand further. What we haven't done yet is managed to bring in data from routine healthcare systems from other countries into our database, and that is proving quite challenging. That's partly to do with systems not necessarily being in place in these countries. Then we also need to think about how we get data and results back to the patients who took part in the study, and I think this is really important. We need to be transparent. So in January, we harnessed NHS systems to write to 12,000 surviving recovery participants to thank them for taking part, tell them the results of the study, and point them to our website where they can find out what we're doing with their data now. So it's all very well being transparent, but people need to know where to look. And I think we need to build that in as a key for clinical trials going forward. We also need to share data with regulators across the world, FDA, as well as the MHRA and the EMA, and they have particular data standards. And one of the challenges for us is not only transforming the routine healthcare data into the standard format that a regulator would expect to see trial data in, but also we have to submit information where that data came from. So how can we show what those data fields mean to the FDA in a way that doesn't involve pointing them at the NHS Digital Data Dictionary? So we're working on how we kind of can present data to regulators that's sourced from the routine healthcare data sources. And thirdly, we need to be able to share the research, the trial data with researchers around the world to make the most of the scientific contribution, which is it actually brings with it its own challenges when the data is coming in from routine data sources, and there may be obligations placed in data sharing agreements and so on. So those are the current challenges on a sort of global front that we are trying to meet, and that's really just food for discussion. So in closing, I'd also like to obviously acknowledge the trial's co-chief investigators, all of them, huge number of staff across the country who've recruited patients into this trial, the 40,000 participants, and all the people in Oxford who worked so hard on it. So thank you very much for your attention.
Beautifully done, Marion, and congratulations to you and all of your colleagues, because recovery is already one of the most often referenced growing bodies of data during the pandemic, rightfully so. You've shown the way, and dexamethasone is now one of a number of advances in which lives truly have been saved. We salute you. You can see why we're only giving 5 minutes. It's obviously a test to see if it can be done. And Callum has done it. Marion has done it. Now it's up to Sarah Stock to take this from the UK, which have been principally in the first two presenters are focused now to an international worldwide group. And let me give you Sarah's title from the University of Edinburgh, Finding New Ways to Bring Data Together from Around the World to Determine the Impact of Lockdown on, in this case, preterm births worldwide. Sarah, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. So I'm talking about preterm birth, and that is babies who are born before 37 completed weeks of gestation. About 15 million babies are born preterm around the world, and this number is rising. And preterm birth complications are the leading cause of baby deaths and deaths in children under 5 years of age, responsible for more than 1 million deaths worldwide a year. And the problem we have is we don't have effective ways of predicting and preventing preterm birth. I'm presenting on behalf of the IPOP Leadership Corps, 6 co-leads, literally spanning from A to Z, both in our surnames and spanning worldwide time zones from Pacific time through to Australia. And what spawned this project was the observation at the start of lockdowns, when there were restrictions on movement, is there seemed to be a reduction in preterm birth. So neonatal units were seemingly empty. Meanwhile, there were also reports from small observational studies suggesting that there might be a rise in stillbirths. And it really led us to this question of, is there really a reduction in preterm birth? Is it genuine with changes in behaviour associated with lockdown? Is it everywhere? Because there are starting to be reports of different patterns coming out, perhaps different patterns in low and middle income countries than in high income settings. And was it just that preterm births were being replaced with other kinds of pregnancy loss. Thinking of perinatal outcomes as a whole, is the preterm birth perhaps turning into a miscarriage or stillbirth? Could we try and investigate this? So in order to do this, we recognised this had to be a global study. Using routine healthcare data, as Marion has alluded to, with the problems that we have with this. This is reproductive healthcare data, so extremely sensitive. Birth registry data in some countries collected routinely, in other places sort of retrospectively collected from hospital ledgers of births. And what we very rapidly have done with the help of ICODA and our other partners is set up a collaboration with now 159 collaborators representing 41 countries, and importantly 21 of these countries are in low and middle income settings. And the idea here is to get sufficient data so that we can start to look at, is there genuinely a reduction in preterm births? See what's happening to stillbirths, and then tie this in with routinely collected data on things like lockdown stringency, air pollution, movement and other infections, to see if we can get any insights into what might be contributing to a reduction that we see, getting insights into new ways that we can understand preterm birth and prevent it in future. So using the natural experiment, as it were, of COVID lockdown to see if we can better understand preterm birth. This project went from a weekend tweet between two of the co-leads to this collaboration in a very quick time. And in doing that, key to that, we're establishing at an early stage guiding principles and bringing the stakeholders along with us. And that's both women, but all the data contributors. So a series of meetings across different time zones, involving them in protocol development, involving in guiding principles and onboarding, working through the frameworks, data flows and agreements needed with a number of different constraints depending on the data source of data sharing, and then curating and analysing the data. Key to this was our parent engagement. From the outset, we involved parent partners at every meeting, co-building the protocol and the grant applications, and working hard now to work with us in low and middle income settings to have some meaningful parent engagement in those settings. Key to getting where we are have been building a number of tools and resources. So from guiding principles and agreements to progress trackers and the spreadsheets of data, we've had to be very clear on the data format that we want in, and the agreements that we have, and all of these tools that our aim is to make these freely available so that they can be used as templates for other projects. So the data is coming into the SAIL data bank at the moment. This slide is a little bit outdated. We now have 10 population level data sets and then 27 institutional level data sets. And the data varies in quality. Many of the population data sets are from very well established birth registries. Some of our data providers are single collaborators collecting data from very under-resourced settings. But in total, we're now at above 25 million births over a period of time, the most, with a small proportion of those being within the pandemic period. What we are doing with these data is meta-analysing them, so looking at the patterns that we see in reduction of preterm birth and any effects on stillbirth, and then trying to quantify whether there's any influence of effects such as World Bank grouping. We're looking at latitude group for seasonality, and as we accumulate more data, we'll have more potential to look at these other factors such as air pollution, which might be mediating or contributing to any changes we see. So this exploratory analysis will be the next stage. So at the moment, this is a global collaboration of perinatal research, where we are, I think it's the largest study of its kind, with the collaborators on board and contributing data to understand perinatal outcomes as a whole. we're already seeing unanticipated insights, so seeing patterns in the preterm birth rates, seasonal patterns that we hadn't expected. Really important when we're looking at the effect of lockdown, and other studies have not been able to do this, so being able to take into account seasonality. But also that's interesting in itself, so giving new insights into areas in which the study of perinatal outcomes and directions it can go. We've been funded for this through ICODA and HDR UK with other grant applications in process, and doing this in time, in a record time. So we hope that in the very near future we're going to be able to give sort of more conclusive answers on the effect of lockdown on women and their babies. But our hope is that this is going to have broader insights into the mechanisms and public health measures that could help reduce preterm birth in the future. Thank you.
Sarah, that was wonderful. Thank you very much for introducing us to IPOP. And again, here an example that goes international in how these data could begin to be assembled really with honesty and integrity, but also with complete transparency. We look forward to the continuation of these studies, which are pioneering. Our fourth and final panelist before our general discussion is Naveen Zarifa, and she's going to be reporting on the International COVID Data Alliance, ICODA. Naveen has a wonderful history that bridges both industry, where she was the steadying voice of all biostatistics at a number of global pharmaceutical companies, and is now really lending that tremendous expertise to ICODA. She brings to it her title, The Joys, Trials, and Disappointments of Working Toward Sharing of Data from RCTs During a Pandemic, using ICODA as the case study. It's a joy to turn it over to you, Naveen Zarifa.
Thank you, Marty, and pleasure to be here. I'm going to stick to my 5 minutes. So let's think about access to data within the context of open science. And I think as we look at this particular slide, you can all start assigning varying grades to how well we've done in the pandemic for each of the hexagons. My premise is that in terms of access to data, we would get a very mixed score. And I'm going to focus primarily on randomized control trial data, not results, but the actual data. And my observation, and perhaps you share it, is that despite the very clear benefits to quite a number of stakeholders, we have not yet achieved timely data sharing when it comes to randomized controlled trials of treatments of COVID-19. So if a pandemic hasn't been sufficient to move the needle, we need to take a page out of ISARIC and say, what are we going to do differently so that we really are prepared next time? So let me take you through the ICODA story. You can see ICODA is a nonprofit organization. We have philanthropic funders, some of which are listed at the bottom. And really the vision is that through a properly organized access mechanism to health research data, we can make a difference in terms of the onward pandemic. And so if we do this right, it also serves as a blueprint for next time around. So the specific part of ICODA that I lead really focuses on randomized controlled trials. And this is kind of the problem statement. There's close to 3,000 of them. This was data from April. They're obviously not all of the same quality or meaningfulness. However, even if you wanted to look only at the top tier of these trials, there really isn't a clear mechanism to do so. So for any big challenge where you need to band together, you have to imagine a future, and that is the common goal. And so we imagine being able to provide clear answers around what treatments do or don't do in varying subgroups, and that could inform policy and treatment for patients. What kinds of questions? Well, you can see them listed here. I think you'd all recognize them as pretty obvious questions to ask yourself. And it turns out that for most of these questions, if not all, you can get to a pretty good answer just using summary level data. By that, I mean means, proportions, Kaplan-Meier estimates, hazard ratios, etc. Those are unimpeded or unencumbered by the usual privacy concerns. And so that's the direction of travel ICODA took, trying to be timely. And so if you can answer these questions on the left, it leads you to being able to do a better job with the next set of trials. Focus your energies where it matters, doing the best possible work. And yet, despite a year's worth of effort, we're not where we want to be. I'll take a moment to tell you why, and this obviously you're going to review at your leisure after. I'll just zoom in on the left-hand side and I'll just pick a couple of these. So let's look at this gray box. Any organization that can move quickly to respond to setting up a randomized controlled trial to study existing drugs to see if they might have an impact in COVID-19, that's going to be a complicated organization. And even though I've spent a lot of time in industry and with academia, and I've got lots of personal relationships, I don't have relationships with all of those decision makers. And guess what? They all need to be aligned. So let's zoom out to the teal at the bottom. This is where the next challenge comes in. Those who provide the data don't have the same incentives or view of that process as those who want to use the data. So if you're providing data, you're seeing extra work, volunteer work, no recognition, and risk. And of course, if you're accessing the data, you're impatient and you see only upside because you're going to be providing clarity. That's a gap that is very clear in our experience in ICODA. So what happened? Well, we thought we had a burning platform, and guess what? It wasn't even smoldering. And so that takes us to the so what and what happens next. Again, I won't go through all of these in detail, but you'll recognize that investigators, if we want to change things, should see not the publication of their trial as the end, but the onward data sharing of the trial as the end of their journey. Funders and policymakers, really think about how you can force accountability here. I think patient groups and the public probably have a role to play. We've got to make it easier, and ICODA certainly is working on looking to do that. And then the bit on the incentives, and I think you all recognize if you want to change behaviors, change the incentives. Whether it's carrots, whether it's sticks, I'm not quite sure. I think it's mainly carrots, but this is probably the most critical piece to work on. So I'll leave you just with this thought before we go to audience questions. I'm a statistician. I've designed hundreds of trials. I've overseen data sharing policies at multiple pharma companies. I understand that there are a lot of considerations, but scientific insight comes from onward data sharing. And so if you want to solve a gnarly problem that matters to people, various diverse viewpoints expressed and received openly are probably the key. So Marty, back to you. And I will stop sharing as soon as I find the button. There we go.
Naveen, thank you again for not only the clarity of her presentation, but also the timeliness of it. What I thought we'd do now is to really have our four panelists who, whilst they have had an opportunity briefly in the past to meet, perhaps, have never really had this opportunity for discussion. And so it is to Colm, Marion, Sarah, and Naveen, we give the first chance, having heard each other's, what are some of the burning new thoughts maybe that you have come up with, and maybe one additional thought that will be able to enhance your own studies. Colm, can we begin with you, please?
Thank you. There's nothing like being put on the spot. The anxiety that local investigators have who've generated data at the bedside have, and the anxiety that a small research group who have generated some very interesting laboratory analysis have, is very hard to overcome and requires a high degree of trust, because the laboratory can only make most of the data if they have the clinical information that goes with it, and the clinician can only take their knowledge into practice if they have laboratory data to support it. And this has been one of the biggest challenges, and even today I've been dealing on the Slack channel for our study with exactly this anxiety. It is very difficult to establish trust and very easy to lose it. What we've done to try and help that is to insist on using very large group authorships. And that is hampered by some journals that insist on having a limited authorship. It seems that these journals are very much 20th century rather than 21st century. So I think that to me is one area that is a stumbling block. The next stumbling block is the desire of some journals not to allow pre-printing. And I'm glad to see that most reputable journals now do allow this. And for ISERIC, we have taken the step that if a journal does not allow it, we go to a different journal. But that's only capable when you've got big muscles. And we wouldn't have felt comfortable in doing that a year ago when we didn't have the muscles to do that. So that's the other challenge. So I think these two challenges. I'll stick to three. The third, for me personally, is that no one wants to invest in pandemic preparedness, and no one wants to invest in data infrastructure. The drivers for data infrastructure tend to be to make billing easier or to make competition within a health service network tighter. So we have to get the mindset of our investors and our politicians and our health service leads to understand that the flow of data will be as important as the value of drugs and the value of ventilators. Moving data will be such an important resource. And I think I'm seeing that improve in the UK. I'm not sure if it will be improving in Europe or the USA for some time. That's my feel, because they have markets. Thank you.
Thank you, Callum. Again, great pablum for a discussion. One takeaway really is the selection of journals, and perhaps an outcome of this meeting of the HDR UK is to assemble some editors and publishers of key journals to literally attack this at a systemic level. For in fact, it is a disincentive. And maybe a question to you, Sarah, from what Callum just said, in lower and middle income countries that you are dealing with them providers of these data, what incentives or disincentives are there when they receive no recognition? Has that come up also in your studies? And is publication, that is the sharing, yes, authorship sharing, really one of the major incentives, or are there others? Over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree with what Callum was saying. And we've been very clear from the outset that IPOP is a team project, and everyone who is involved will be recognised as a member of the team. And one of the first things we did was establish guiding principles, which had some of these things laid out clearly to try and alleviate worries about this. We've committed to group for authorship, named authorship. Within our protocol, we have more than 50 authors. It makes finding reviewers a nightmare when you've got big teams in a relatively narrow field. But it's so important that to have the trust of all of our collaborators and bring them along with you, and for them to get the recognition for the incredible amount of work that they're doing. So I think that's been a really key thing for us. I think there's also sort of there's the trust. What we do is we have very different constraints to the provision of data, and I think this is something that Marion alluded to in her talk as well, with the use of routine data and how you harmonise that data, how you get it to from different countries in a structure that you need and is usable for your purposes, and also. For us, using birth registry data, there are legal requirements bound up in the countries providing that data for the use of the birth data. So key to IPOP is open data, transparent data. We want to be able to data share, but we're having to negotiate data sets being provided which can only be provided for a very narrow, very specific question, and would need further approvals for every single reuse of that data, even if that data is derived. Now, that's not across all of our data sets. We have some data sets which data providers are very keen to use IPOP and ICODA as a platform for reuse of data. But we have to work within these different levels of restriction and constraint without losing the trust of the contributors. And I think that the other point, which also reflects what Callum was saying, within that, what we have always said is that the data can go along with parallel with the local research. It can be used local and nationally. We are not restrictive to other collaborations, so that we're bringing people along with us. It's not an IPOP or bust, or IPOP and you can't publish alone. We're encouraging people to use the best methods within their own data sets to publish, but we're bringing the data together to answer these specific questions that can only be answered when we collaborate.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. Marion, Sarah referred to a tangent that I'd like you to pick up on, and that is what experiences in not only the recovery study, but in your studies in general at Oxford bear on this question about not only validating and valuing all data from around the world, but also being able to find ways to efficiently and clearly not just publish, but to really promulgate.
Yeah, thank you,
Mary.
Martin. And you may be aware, but within our unit in Oxford, we've got several overviews in vascular disease that have brought together individual patient data in individual patient data meta-analysis. So the anti-thrombotic treatment trialist collaboration and the cholesterol treatment trialist collaboration. So that's something which for decades, to address those particular questions, we've been bringing data together. I think there are challenges, and I think what we have to do is systematically address the incentives for sharing and deal with the disincentives. And so I think the incentives, you've touched on publication. I think actually we had this conversation with the people who've worked tirelessly to set up the UK Biobank. The people who set up that prospective cohort study and are not necessarily named as authors on the publications that arise from that wonderful data collection. And actually we need to try and rethink how we value researchers' contributions. Should it be just based on publication? And also address, when you've got your editors together, why it's so hard to get methodology published, why the people who are really doing groundbreaking methodology to make these things happen don't get their articles in high impact journals, and the people who are receiving the data and produce some analyses do. So I think there's a lot we can do to deal with the incentives. We look at the disincentives. I think we just have to do, and in its it's hard enough doing trials. Actually, it's hard work. They're not easy to do, and we have to absolutely make it as easy as possible for people to share. And whatever that might be, and that's got to be dealing more systematically with the governance issues. We've been at this in recovery for quite a long time, across the different data custodians who are giving us data, and we've got to bring that together and make it easy. Yes, those are real issues. Yes, participant privacy is a real issue, but we've got to have a more systematic approach, and then make the actual extraction and delivery, the platform, if it's already accredited, and you don't need to even think any further than that, as you touched on, Naveen, with an ISO accreditation, that's it. It's just a tick in the box. You don't need to worry about it anymore. These are the things we're going to go systematically. So we've got to beef up the incentives and deal with the disincentives.
Brilliant.
People should do it. It should be business as usual, part of the course, to be sharing the data.
I love that clenched fist of yours, Marion, for the emphasis that it needs to give. And no one can now follow you better than Naveen, and we have about 1 minute. Only you could do it. Give us a summation with 2 clenched fists. Have all 97 participants. Yes, we've graduated from a seminar room to an auditorium. God knows these panelists deserve it. Carry us forward now, Naveen, and close our session, please.
Thank you. I think what we've heard is that it pays off to be prepared ahead of time. We've seen those examples time and time again. The other thing that I have heard, Marty, is that there's clarity around having a common goal. There's less agreement around the strategies to achieve that goal. And so having an openness of mind to diverse views and ideas around the solutions is likely going to be the key. But the winning piece is there is a common goal. So keeping focused on that will likely get us to the solution.
Bless you. Callum, Marion, Sarah, Naveen, thank you. Andrew Morris, our inspiration, thank you. And Julia for keeping me on time, as many other things, we thank you. Back to you.